This 4-year-old beggar girl makes a request at the counter. Can I eat the leftovers? But she didn't know a millionaire was watching everything and something happens. Comment. What you think is going to happen? Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The June morning in Willow Creek dawned with that humid chill characteristic of upstate New York, and the first rays of sunlight barely managed to pierce the heavy clouds gathering over the town. At Benny's bakery, the familiar aroma of freshly baked sourdough mingled with the steam from the coffee bubbling in the stainless steel urns, creating that welcoming atmosphere that made the small, century-old bakery a traditional meeting place for the locals. Arthur Mendelsohn, 58 years old, occupied his usual table in the right-hand corner of the establishment, as he had religiously done for 15 years. His carefully manicured hands held a coffee mug as his eyes scanned the pages of the local newspaper, absorbing the news about the regional economy with the meticulous attention he devoted to all aspects of his ordered life. The impeccably pressed grey suit and polished dress shoes reflected the success he had achieved in the custom furniture business, transforming a small carpentry shop inherited from his father into one of the most respected companies in the region. It was during this moment of morning routine that a movement near the counter caught his attention. A small and fragile figure timidly approached the clerk, her bare feet contrasting starkly with the cold tile floor of the bakery. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and her floral dress, clearly patched in several places, hung loosely on her thin frame. Her brown hair, though disheveled, shone with that natural luminosity of childhood, and when she looked up to speak to the clerk, Arthur could see brown eyes that carried a disturbing mixture of hope and resignation. "Can I eat the leftovers?" The girl's voice was so low that Arthur had to lean forward slightly to hear. Her words echoed in the sudden silence of the bakery, causing other customers to pause their morning conversations. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Carol, looked at the child with an expression that mixed compassion and concern. Her fingers hesitated on the counter for a few seconds before reaching for a brown paper bag. "Of course, honey," Carol replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I have some day-old bread left over from yesterday. It's still good." She began to put in the bag not only the stale bread, but also some fresh corn muffins and a small container of cream cheese. The girl watched each movement with intense attention, as if she were recording in her memory every gesture of kindness. Arthur felt something clench in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was as if a part of himself, carefully buried under layers of professional success and emotional detachment, was suddenly exposed to that cold June morning. His fingers involuntarily tightened around the coffee mug as he watched the girl accept the bag, with a gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the size of the gesture, but perfectly suited to the magnitude of her need. "What's your name, sweetie?" Carol asked, bending down to be at the child's level. "Isabel," the girl replied, her voice gaining a little more confidence. "I live nearby with my sister, Violet." She pointed vaguely toward the street, and Arthur noticed how her small hands trembled slightly, unsure if from cold or from something else he preferred not to imagine. When Isabel left the bakery, her hurried steps revealed an urgency that went beyond simple hunger. Arthur temporarily abandoned the newspaper and watched her through the misty window. He saw her carefully cross the town square, avoiding the puddles from the previous night's rain, until she disappeared into the alleyways leading to the south end, one of the oldest and most impoverished areas of the town. The routine that Arthur had carefully cultivated for 15 years was completely disrupted that morning. He remained in the bakery long past his usual time, asking Carol discreet questions about the girl. He learned that Isabel had been appearing at the bakery for about 2 months, always at the same time, always with the same timid question about leftovers. Carol mentioned occasionally seeing a teenage girl waiting for her outside, presumably the older sister she had mentioned. During the drive to his company, Arthur couldn't concentrate on the morning traffic or the work calls he normally took in the car. The image of Isabel's eyes persisted in his mind, bringing with it memories he had buried deep. He remembered his own childhood, when his father abandoned the family, leaving them in extreme financial hardship. He recalled the feeling of humiliation when needing to ask for help, the hunger he sometimes felt when his mother worked double shifts to support the household. These memories accompanied him throughout the work morning. While approving budgets and discussing expansion strategies with his team, a part of his mind remained at Benny's bakery, picturing a 6-year-old girl asking for leftovers. Around noon, Arthur made a decision that surprised even himself. He cancelled all his afternoon meetings and decided to return to the bakery area. What he found left him even more disturbed. Discreetly following the path he had seen Isabel take in the morning, he arrived at the south end and discovered a world that existed parallel to his, but completely invisible in his daily routine. The simple houses, many in need of repair, contrasted sharply with the gated community where he lived. Children played in the dirt streets while their mothers hung clothes on makeshift clotheslines. It was then that he saw Isabel again, this time playing alone in a small vacant lot near the main church. She had built an imaginary house using stones and dry branches and was talking animatedly to a rag doll that looked like it had seen better days. Even in her solitary play, there was a melancholy that touched Arthur deeply. The child seemed to be creating a fantasy world to escape the reality that surrounded her. Arthur remained watching from afar, hidden behind a tree, feeling simultaneously intrusive and protective. It was when a tired-looking teenager approached Isabel, and he immediately recognized that it must be Violet, the older sister. The girl appeared to be around 16 years old and carried a bag with cleaning supplies. Her movements revealed a forced maturity, as if she had been forced to grow up too quickly. The conversation between the sisters was too low for Arthur to hear, but the body language spoke for itself. Violet constantly checked if Isabel had eaten, affectionately arranged her hair, and hugged her with a protection that seemed disproportionate to the age difference between them. It was evident that she had assumed maternal responsibilities that shouldn't be hers at that age. When night fell, Arthur made a discovery that left him deeply disturbed. The two sisters headed to a small alcove under the side staircase of the main church, where they had improvised a shelter with cardboard and a thin blanket. It was there that they slept, protected only by the kindness of Father Michael and the discretion of the darkness. The reality that 2 children were living on the streets in his own town, while he slept comfortably in a 2,000-square-foot house, was like a punch in the gut. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He remained on the porch of his house, looking in the direction of the town center, knowing that a few miles away, 2 girls were trying to keep warm under a staircase. For the first time in years, he deeply questioned the choices he had made in his life, the way he had built walls between himself and the suffering around him. When he finally fell asleep, it was past 3 in the morning, and his dreams were populated by brown eyes that asked not only for food, but something much bigger that he didn't yet know how to offer. The following days brought a radical change in Arthur's routine. What had once been a perfectly timed life between company, gym, and home now included strategic stops at Benny's bakery. He arrived earlier, prolonged his breakfast, and discreetly watched Isabel's daily arrival. The girl always appeared at the same time, around 8:30 in the morning, with that same expression of timid hope that had marked their first meeting. Carol, the clerk, had noticed Arthur's sudden interest in the girl's situation. In discreet conversations, she revealed details that left the businessman even more disturbed. The sisters had appeared in the town approximately 2 months ago, apparently fleeing some difficult situation. Violet, the older one, worked cleaning houses in the neighborhood, always carrying Isabel along when the employers allowed it. During the second week of observation, Arthur took the courage to do his own investigations. He spoke with Mrs. Davis, owner of the bakery, a 70-year-old woman who knew all the inhabitants of Willow Creek as if they were her own family. It was she who told the most complete story of the girls, revealing details that explained much about the desperate situation they were in. "They came from Albany," explained Mrs. Davis, while organizing the bread in the display case. "Little Isabel barely spoke when they arrived here. Violet told Father Michael that they lived with an aunt, but that the situation was unsustainable. She never gave more details, but from the way the girl shrinks when men approach too quickly, I imagine it wasn't just harsh words they suffered." This revelation hit Arthur like a blow. The possibility that Isabel had suffered abuse explained her excessive shyness and the protective way Violet always positioned herself between her and the world. Observing more carefully in the following days, he noticed other signs: how Isabel startled at sudden noises, how she avoided physical contact, even affectionate, how her eyes became vigilant when she perceived the presence of unfamiliar adults. It was during his third week of observation that the first significant turning point occurred. Arthur had decided to work late at his company, reviewing contracts for a large order of custom furniture for a regional hotel. Around 9 at night, when heading to the parking lot, he heard the sound of a vacuum cleaner coming from the second floor of the building. Curious, he went up to check, thinking that perhaps someone from the outsourced cleaning crew had forgotten to report extra work. What he found left him completely paralyzed. In the hallway of his own office, a teenager in a blue uniform pushed a cleaning cart, moving with silent efficiency between the rooms. When she turned around, Arthur immediately recognized the face. It was Violet, Isabel's older sister. The girl he had observed caring for the little one with such devotion was an employee of his own company, working the night cleaning shift. The shock was mutual. Violet froze upon seeing the boss standing in the hallway, her eyes widening in evident panic. For a few endless seconds they simply stared at each other, both processing the impossible coincidence of the situation. Arthur saw in the teenager's face not only surprise, but genuine fear, as if she were about to lose something precious. How long have you been working here?" Arthur asked, his voice coming out rougher than intended due to the emotion. Violet lowered her eyes, her hands nervously squeezing the cleaning cloth. "Almost 2 months, sir. Since we arrived in town. Mr. Edwards hired me for the night shift." Her voice was low but filled with a dignity that impressed Arthur. The conversation that followed revealed much about Violet's personality. She explained that she had lied about her age to get the job, saying she was 18 when in fact she was only 16. She worked from 8 at night to 4 in the morning, cleaning all the floors of the building, and then hurried to pick up Isabel at the small makeshift shelter under the church staircase. The minimum wage she received barely covered basic food for both, and she dreamed of saving enough money to rent a small room where they could have privacy and security. "Why did you run away from Albany?" Arthur asked, sitting in one of the office chairs to be at her level. Violet hesitated for long seconds, her eyes revealing an internal struggle between the need to keep secrets and the desire to trust someone. "Our Aunt Ruth. She wasn't a good person," she finally said, her words laden with poorly disguised pain. After we were left alone, we went to live with her. At first it seemed normal, but then the beatings started for any reason. Isabel couldn't even cry without getting slapped, and when she started receiving visits from strange men at home—" Violet couldn't finish the sentence, but Arthur perfectly understood the implications. The anger that took hold of him at that moment was different from anything he had ever felt. It was a protective, visceral fury, directed at adults who had failed to protect 2 innocent children. At the same time, he felt a profound admiration for Violet's courage, who at 16 had made the desperate decision to flee with a 6-year-old child to protect her from an abusive situation. "You can't keep living on the streets," Arthur said, his voice filled with determination. "It's not safe for you two, especially with Isabel so young. Violet straightened up, and for the first time since the conversation had begun, her eyes showed something akin to irritation. "We manage, Mr. Mendelssohn," she replied, her voice taking on a defensive tone. "I know it's not the ideal situation, but it's temporary. I'm saving money to rent a place. We don't need charity." The word was pronounced with a bitterness that revealed deep wounds. Previous experiences with adults who had confused genuine help with disguised humiliation. Arthur realized he had stepped on delicate ground. Violet's independence, her refusal to accept what she perceived as pity, was both a strength and a vulnerability. She had learned to distrust the kindness of adults, and he couldn't blame her for that, considering what they had been through. In the days following this discovery, Arthur found himself in a complex emotional dilemma. Knowing the girl's story made it impossible to continue his normal life, but any attempt at direct help was met with Violet's proud resistance. He began to purposefully leave some extra snacks in the room where she worked, pretending to have forgotten them. Occasionally, he also forgot small amounts of money in places where she could find them without it seeming like deliberate charity. The second minor turning point came when Edwards, the HR manager, mentioned casually during a meeting that the night cleaning employee was being one of the best they had ever hired. "That girl Violet is impressive," he commented. "She leaves everything spotless and even organizes papers that were messy. She has initiative that many long-time employees don't have." Arthur found himself divided between the pride he felt for Violet and the concern for her situation. It was evident that she had the potential for much more than cleaning offices, but her circumstances kept her trapped in a cycle of survival that didn't allow for bigger dreams. The intelligence she demonstrated by spontaneously organizing documents was the same she had used to plan the escape from Albany and keep Isabel safe and fed. The end of the second month brought a worrying worsening of the situation. The June rains became more intense, and the small shelter under the church staircase didn't offer adequate protection against the humidity. Arthur noticed that Isabel had developed a persistent cough that worsened each day. Her morning visits to the bakery became rarer, and when she appeared, she was visibly thinner and paler. Arthur's concern reached a critical point on the morning when Isabel fainted at the bakery. He was at his usual table when he saw the girl stumble in, her breathing clearly labored by the cough. Before Carol could react, Isabel fell to the ground, unconscious. The silence that followed in the bakery was broken only by the sound of Arthur quickly rising from his chair, all his inhibitions about directly interfering in the girls' lives, evaporating in the face of the medical emergency unfolding before his eyes. Isabel's fainting at the bakery transformed Arthur's discreet observation into immediate action. Without hesitating, he knelt beside the unconscious girl, checking her breathing while Carol ran to get water. Isabel's skin was too hot, and her breathing came in worrying wheezes that showed a serious respiratory infection. Mrs. Davis immediately called 911, while other customers gathered around, offering help and advice. When Isabel regained consciousness a few minutes later, her disoriented eyes searched for Violet. "Where's my sister?" she asked with a weak voice, trying to get up despite the evident dizziness. Arthur gently supported her, feeling through the thin fabric of the dress how prominent her bones were. Malnutrition, combined with the illness, had left the girl in an alarming state of fragility. "We're going to find your sister," Arthur promised, carrying Isabel to his car. "But first, we need to take you to the doctor." During the drive to the urgent care clinic, Isabel clung to his arm with surprising strength for her weakened state, as if she feared being abandoned again. Her feverish words revealed fragments of traumatic memories, mentions of strange men, screams in her aunt's house, hungry nights. At the urgent care clinic, the diagnosis was early-stage pneumonia, aggravated by constant exposure to cold and humidity. The doctor, Miller, an experienced man who knew well the social difficulties of the region, explained that Isabel would need specific medications and rest in a warm and dry environment. "She's malnourished too," he added, looking directly at Arthur. "She'll need nutritional support and constant care for the next few days." It was then that Violet arrived, running to the clinic in total panic. Someone at the bakery had told her about Isabel's fainting, and she had abandoned her house-cleaning job to rush after her sister. Her eyes red from crying, and her trembling hands revealed the terror of a young woman who had only her sister as family in the world. When she saw Arthur holding Isabel's hand on the clinic bed, her expression contorted in a complex mixture of gratitude and distrust. "What are you doing here?" Violet asked, her voice filled with conflicting emotions. "How did you know she was sick?" The question revealed not only surprise, but genuine concern about how far Arthur had been observing their lives. For a young woman who had learned to be cautious with adults, his presence at such a vulnerable moment was simultaneously comforting and threatening. Arthur explained about the fainting at the bakery, carefully omitting the fact that he had been watching them for weeks. Violet listened in silence, her eyes alternating between him and Isabel, who had fallen asleep under the effect of the fever medication. When Dr. Miller explained about the need for expensive medications and special care, Violet visibly paled, mentally calculating how much this would cost from her already insufficient salary. "I can pay for the medications," Arthur offered, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Isabel. Violet's reaction was immediate and fierce. She rose from the chair as if she had received a shock, her eyes flashing with an anger that came from deep wounds. "We're not beggars, Mr. Mendelssohn," she said, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "What we need is opportunity, not handouts. We've been through this before, adults who feel good about themselves, helping us for a while until they get tired or demand something in return." The words came out as a painful confession of past experiences that had taught her that the kindness of adults often came with a price. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Arthur recognized in Violet's reaction not only wounded pride, but the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned too early about the conditional nature of human generosity. He saw in her eyes the same determination he had felt at 30, when he lost everything and swore to rebuild his life without depending on anyone. "Then let me offer you work," Arthur said finally. "I know you already work cleaning my company, but I can offer extra hours, maybe some administrative tasks. I've seen how you organize the documents spontaneously. You have the potential for much more." It was a genuine offer, but Violet received it with evident skepticism. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You barely know me. Why would an important businessman care about two girls from the streets?" The question was direct and deserved an honest answer, but Arthur struggled to articulate feelings that he himself didn't fully understand. During the following days, while Isabel slowly recovered from pneumonia at the urgent care clinic, a strange routine was established. Violet spent the mornings taking care of her sister, worked in the afternoon cleaning houses, and returned to the hospital at night. Arthur appeared daily with excuses to check on the girl's condition, bringing children's books, fruits, and small toys that he left casually beside the bed. It was during one of these visits that the third turning point occurred. Edwards, the HR manager, appeared at the hospital with resignation papers for Violet. "I'm very sorry," he said, genuinely embarrassed, "but she's missed 3 consecutive days without notifying. Company policy is clear about that." Arthur watched the horror spreading across Violet's face as she realized she had lost her only source of income. The irony of the situation didn't escape Arthur. He himself had created those rigid HR policies, priding himself on their efficiency and impartiality. Now, seeing a young woman lose her job for taking care of a sick sister, he realized how his corporate rules completely ignored the humanity of the people who worked for him. Edwards was only following protocols that Arthur had established, without any consideration for personal circumstances. "The dismissal is suspended," Arthur said, his voice carrying an authority that didn't admit discussion. "And I want a complete review of our policies for excused absences. Family emergency situations should have differentiated treatment." Edwards left confused, but Violet didn't show gratitude. On the contrary, her expression became even more closed. "Now I owe my job to you," she said bitterly. "That's exactly what I didn't want to happen. Now I'm your protégé, not your employee." Her words revealed a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics, impressive for someone so young. She understood that accepting favors created emotional debts that could be collected later. The situation became even more complicated when Dr. Miller informed that Isabel would need at least 2 weeks of complete rest in a controlled environment to fully recover. The urgent care clinic couldn't keep her for that long, and the shelter under the church staircase was completely inadequate for a child in recovery. Violet became visibly desperate, calculating and recalculating options that simply didn't exist. It was at that moment that information arrived that would change everything. Mrs. Davis appeared at the hospital with news that left both Arthur and Violet shocked. "I found out who owns the real estate agency that manages the cheap rentals in town," she announced, her eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "It's a woman named Bernice Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn like you, Arthur. Is she related to you?" The name hit Arthur like lightning. Bernice was his ex-wife, the woman who had left 10 years earlier, taking with her not only half of his assets, but also his ability to genuinely trust other people. Knowing that she was back in town, and worse, that she controlled the low-income housing market, created implications that he still couldn't fully process. Was my wife," Arthur replied, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. Violet watched him carefully, noticing the sudden change in his expression. There was a story there, something painful that explained much about the businessman's cautious behavior. "Why does that matter?" she asked, although she already suspected that the answer would be significant. Mrs. Davis explained that Bernice had arrived in town about 3 months ago, buying cheap properties and increasing rents drastically. Many low-income families had been evicted, including some that Violet knew from her work as a cleaning lady. The temporal coincidence with the girl's arrival in town didn't go unnoticed by anyone. "Was she the one who evicted you from the last place you lived?" Arthur asked, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Violet's expression confirmed his worst expectations. The woman who had destroyed his emotional life 10 years ago was now indirectly responsible for the suffering of the 2 people he most wanted to protect at the moment. Isabel chose that moment to wake up, her weak voice calling for Violet. When she saw all the adults around her bed with tense expressions, her eyes filled with tears. "Are we in trouble again?" she asked, her voice revealing a premature experience with complex adult situations. The innocent question cut the hearts of everyone present, reminding them that at the center of all that complexity was a 6-year-old child who only wanted security and love. Isabel's recovery brought a period of tense calm that lasted only 2 weeks. Arthur had managed to convince Father Michael to allow the girls to stay temporarily in a small room in the back of the church, heated and dry enough for the child's convalescence. Violet accepted the arrangement reluctantly, only because Isabel's health was a priority. But her distrust of Arthur's motives remained evident in every interaction. During this period, Arthur discovered surprising aspects of Violet's personality that only confirmed his impression that she possessed extraordinary potential wasted by circumstances. The young woman had spontaneously organized the church's old files, creating a cataloging system that impressed even Father Michael. Furthermore, she demonstrated a natural ability with numbers when helping Mrs. Davis with the bakery's accounting during her spare hours. "She has a brilliant mind," commented Mrs. Davis one morning, while watching Violet teach Isabel to do basic math using colorful pebbles. It's a shame she's never had the opportunity to study properly. I imagine what she could become with proper education." The words echoed in Arthur's mind, fueling an idea that had been gradually forming. The relative tranquility was brutally interrupted when Bernice appeared at the church one July morning. Arthur was visiting Isabel, who had finally fully recovered from pneumonia, when he heard the familiar and icy voice of his ex-wife echoing through the hallway. 10 years hadn't been enough to erase the authoritarian tone she used when she wanted to intimidate people she considered inferior. "Father Michael, I need to discuss a legal matter about these irregular occupants," Bernice was saying, her cutting voice reaching clearly to the room where they were. "The church doesn't have authorization to house people indefinitely. There are issues of civil liability and compliance with municipal regulations." Arthur felt his blood run cold as he recognized the strategy she always used, turning human issues into bureaucratic problems to avoid moral discussions. Violet visibly paled at hearing the conversation. She recognized that voice. She had dealt with Bernice when she was evicted from the last place they lived before arriving at the church. "It's her," she whispered to Arthur, her eyes revealing genuine fear. "The woman who put us on the street. She said property wasn't a place for bums." The word bums was pronounced with a bitterness that revealed how much that humiliation had hurt. Arthur rose from the chair where he was reading to Isabel, feeling a familiar anger growing in his chest. It was the same sensation he had experienced 10 years ago when he discovered that Bernice had manipulated financial documents to misappropriate part of his assets during the divorce. The difference was that now she wasn't just attacking him, but 2 children who had become inexplicably important in his life. The confrontation that followed in the church hallway was tense and charged with personal history. Bernice stopped abruptly upon seeing Arthur emerge from the room, her expression of surprise quickly turning into a calculated smile that he knew well. "Arthur," she said, her voice adopting a falsely sweet tone. "What an interesting coincidence to find you here." "Developed a sudden interest in Christian charity. Developed a sudden interest in persecuting children," Arthur replied, his voice laden with a coldness that surprised even himself. 10 years of therapy and personal growth evaporated before the woman who had almost destroyed his ability to trust other people. "Or is this just a continuation of your specialty in destroying lives for personal profit?" Bernice laughed, a humorless sound that echoed unpleasantly through the religious hallway. "Always the dramatic one," she said, adjusting her expensive purse on her shoulder. "Actually, I'm here on business. This town has untapped real estate potential, and people like these—" She gestured vaguely in the direction of the room where Violet and Isabel were. "Depress property values. It's a matter of responsible urban development." It was then that Violet came out of the room, carrying Isabel in her arms. The girl had insisted on seeing what was happening, worried about the raised voices. The presence of the 2 sisters instantly changed the dynamics of the confrontation. Bernice looked at them with an expression that mixed disdain and something akin to analytical curiosity, as if she were evaluating merchandise. "Ah, the famous occupants," Bernice said, her voice taking on a dangerously smooth tone. "Violet, isn't it? I remember you. Very emotional when you were informed about the eviction. I hope you've learned to accept economic realities with more maturity." Her words were carefully chosen to humiliate, and Arthur saw how they hit Violet squarely. "Leave them alone, Bernice," Arthur said, taking a step forward. "They haven't done anything to you." Her response was a smile that he had learned to fear during their years of marriage. It was the expression she used when she had discovered a vulnerability that she could exploit. "Ah, but it's interesting how you've become their protector," Bernice said, her eyes shining with a familiar malice. 10 years without talking, and when we meet again, you're defending 2 refugees. What a touching transformation." The pause before the word refugees was deliberate and cruel. Isabel, who had remained silent in Violet's arms, chose that moment to speak. "Why are you mean?" she asked with the devastating honesty of small children. "Why don't you like us?" The simple question created an awkward silence in the hallway, exposing the cruelty of Bernice's behavior in a way that adult arguments couldn't. For a moment, Bernice's mask of professional coldness faltered. Arthur saw an expression that might have been embarrassment flash quickly across her face before being replaced by the familiar hardness. "Because, dear," she said, bending down to be at Isabel's level, "in the real world, people need to work to deserve things. They can't simply occupy properties that don't belong to them." "We work," Violet said, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "I work every day. We're not bums or freeloaders. We just needed a safe place for my sister to recover." Her words carried a dignity that contrasted dramatically with Bernice's behavior. It was then that Father Michael finally intervened, arriving with his calm but authoritative presence. "Mrs. Mendelssohn," he said, his voice carrying decades of experience in dealing with conflict situations, "I believe this discussion would be more appropriate in my office. The children don't need to be exposed to unnecessary stress." During the meeting that followed in the priest's office, important revelations came to light. Bernice explained that she had bought several properties in the town through an investment company, with plans for gentrification that included the removal of undesirable elements from the central region. Her words were technical and cold, but their implications were clear. Families like Violet and Isabel simply had no place in the vision of the future she had for Willow Creek. "And you have legal documentation for all these properties?" Arthur asked, his business experience allowing him to identify possible irregularities in Bernice's discourse. His question hit a sensitive point, evidenced by her slight hesitation before answering. "Naturally," she said, but there was something in her tone that suggested that the issue of documentation might not be as simple as she claimed. "All the papers are in order, approved by the city and registered in the county clerk's office. This is a completely legitimate enterprise." However, when Mrs. Davis appeared in the office with disturbing information, the situation took a completely unexpected turn. "Father Michael," she said, breathless from running, "I found something important in the church's old files, about that land where the girls used to play." She looked significantly at Violet. "The land that your family lost years ago. I have documents here that may be of interest." The fifth turning point was revealed when Mrs. Davis presented old deeds that proved that the land in question had belonged to Violet and Isabel's family through their grandmother, Antonia Silva. The property had been lost years ago in questionable circumstances when the grandmother had been convinced to sign documents that she didn't fully understand. Now they discovered that Bernice had bought precisely that land, knowing of its dubious origin. "That doesn't prove anything," Bernice said, but her voice had lost some of its previous confidence. "Old transactions, lost documents. These are matters that the courts will resolve if necessary." However, Arthur noticed nervousness in her gestures, the way she avoided direct eye contact. Violet looked at the documents with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For years, she had heard her grandmother talk about the injustice she had suffered, but she never imagined that there could be documentary evidence. "That land. She always said it was ours by right," she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched the yellowed papers. But no one believed her. They said it was just an old woman's ramblings. The tension in the priest's office became almost palpable when Bernice realized that her legal position might not be as solid as she had calculated. Her eyes met Arthur's, and for the first time in 10 years, he saw something that might have been genuine fear in her expression. The game had changed, and now she was in the position of having to defend herself instead of attacking. The months that followed the discovery of the property documents completely transformed the dynamics between everyone involved. Bernice had left the priest's office with an expression that Arthur hadn't seen in 10 years. Genuine vulnerability mixed with a calculated anger that made him fear her next moves. Violet, in turn, oscillated between cautious hope and total disbelief that justice could really exist for people like them. The investigation into the legitimacy of the land ownership revealed a web of corruption that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. Mrs. Davis, working tirelessly in the church and city hall archives, discovered that Bernice had used forged documents to acquire not only the land of Violet's family, but at least 5 other properties in the town. Her strategy was always the same: identify land with confusing documentation or vulnerable elderly owners, offer ridiculously low amounts, and use her influence to expedite questionable legal transfers. "She's not just mean," explained Mrs. Davis one afternoon, spreading documents on the bakery table. "She's systematic. She arrived here with a very well-developed plan to appropriate the most valuable properties in the town by paying almost nothing for them." The papers revealed a disturbing pattern of exploitation that had affected dozens of families over the past few months. Arthur found himself in an impossible position. Supporting Violet legally meant directly confronting Bernice, something he had avoided for 10 years to preserve his own emotional stability. But seeing Violet's silent suffering, who had finally found hope of recovering something that legitimately belonged to her family, made it impossible to remain neutral. "I'm going to help you with the legal costs," he said one morning, finding Violet organizing the old documents at the church. Her response was predictable and painful. "Why?" she asked, her eyes revealing a distrust that had deepened with time. "What do you gain by protecting us against your own ex-wife? It doesn't make sense." The question forced Arthur to confront motivations that he himself didn't fully understand. Was it guilt for the 10 years of comfortable life while people like Violet and Isabel suffered? Was it a way to redeem himself from the selfish choices he had made after the divorce? Or was there something deeper, a genuine connection with those 2 sisters that had awakened in him an ability to love that he thought he had lost forever? "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied finally, knowing that the answer was simultaneously true and insufficient. Violet studied him for long moments before nodding slowly, but her expression made it clear that she wasn't entirely convinced of his motivations. The 6th turning point came when they discovered that the situation was even more complicated than they imagined. During the research for the legal process, a lawyer hired by Arthur discovered that Zelda, Violet, and Isabel's mother was alive and interned in a rehabilitation clinic in Poughkeepsie. The information came through old hospital records that mentioned Violet as an emergency contact. Violet received the news like a punch to the stomach. For months, she had lied to Isabel about her mother's whereabouts, inventing a story about an accident to spare her the truth. Zelda had consciously abandoned her daughters to follow a man who had promised to take her out of addiction, leaving them with Aunt Ruth. The admission to the clinic had only happened after the destructive relationship ended, and she hit rock bottom in her addiction. "She's alive?" Isabel asked when Violet finally told the truth, her tears mixing joy and confusion. "Why didn't she come to get us?" The innocent question opened wounds that Violet had struggled to keep closed. How to explain to a 6-year-old child that her mother had chosen drugs and a violent man instead of her own daughters? Arthur, moved by compassion and perhaps by the need to do something tangible to help, decided to discreetly pay for Zelda's treatment at the clinic. It was then that he discovered something that left him deeply disturbed. The clinic belonged to a business group of which Bernice was a majority partner. His ex-wife was literally profiting from the suffering of the family he was trying to protect. The discovery led to an inevitable confrontation between Arthur and Bernice in her office, a luxurious room that contrasted drastically with the simplicity of the church where Violet and Isabel still lived. "You've always been naive," Bernice said, distractedly shuffling papers on her desk. "Believing that you can save everyone, solve all problems with money and goodwill. And you've always been calculating," Arthur replied, struggling to remain calm. "Turning human suffering into profit opportunities. How can you sleep at night knowing that you're destroying families?" His question provoked the first genuine smile he had seen on her face since the reunion. "Very well, thank you," she said, "because I understand how the world really works. You want to know the truth about your precious Violet and her family. You want to know why their grandmother lost that land." Her words carried a promise of revelation that made Arthur's stomach clench. The seventh turning point was devastating. Bernice revealed that she had thoroughly investigated the Silver family's past and discovered that Antonia, Violet, and Isabel's grandmother had lost the land not because of fraud, but because she had used the property as collateral to pay off her husband's gambling debts. The documents that Mrs. Davis had found in the church were legitimate but incomplete. There were other papers, kept in the county clerk's office, that proved that the transfer of the property had been legal, even if morally questionable. "Your heroine lived with a gambling addict," Bernice continued, each word chosen to cause maximum damage. "When he accumulated debts he couldn't pay, she was forced to hand over the land to save his life. It's a sad story, but completely legal. The land belongs to me by right." More. The information reached Violet through Arthur, who struggled to find appropriate words to communicate the discovery. Seeing the hope drain from the young woman's eyes was one of the most painful experiences of his life. "So it was never really ours," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "All this was for nothing. My grandmother lied to us all these years." "She didn't lie," Arthur said gently. "She probably believed she had been deceived. And considering the circumstances, maybe she really was taken advantage of in a moment of desperation." But his words of comfort rang hollow-faced with the magnitude of Violet's disappointment. Isabel, who had heard part of the conversation, approached her sister with the simple wisdom of children. "It doesn't matter," she said, hugging Violet. "We don't need land to be a family. We have each other." Her words brought tears to Arthur's eyes, reminding him that sometimes the deepest truths come from the simplest perspectives. It was in that moment of apparent defeat that information arrived that would change everything once again. Mrs. Davis burst into the church with news that had arrived through a letter from Canada. "Girls," she said, breathless from the run, "I have news about Isabel's father. Andrew finally received my letter and is coming back to the United States." The eighth and biggest turning point was revealed when Mrs. Davis explained that Andrew, her foster son, who had emigrated to Canada years ago, was Isabel's real father. Zelda had lied about the child's paternity, inventing a story about a married man to hide the fact that she had cheated on Andrew when he still lived in town. Now, at 28 years old and a successful engineer in Toronto, he had discovered the existence of his daughter through Mrs. Davis's letter and was returning to the United States immediately. "He wants to meet Isabel," Mrs. Davis said, her hands trembling with emotion. "But he also wants to understand the whole situation. About you two, about what you've been through, about how you can move forward as a family." The news brought a new and terrifying complexity for Violet. Finally, Isabel would have a present father and financial resources, but this could mean losing her forever. The prospect of separation of the sisters created a tension that affected all the small community that had formed around them. Arthur saw in Violet the same terror he had felt when he realized that Bernice was taking everything he had built. It was the fear of losing the only thing that really mattered, the only person that gave meaning to the daily struggle for survival. "What's going to happen to us?" Isabel asked one night as they prepared to sleep in the small room at the church. Violet hugged her sister, fighting against tears that threatened to reveal her own fears. "We're going to stay together," she promised, although she had no idea how she could fulfill that promise in the face of the changes that were approaching. The arrival of Andrew in the United States brought a transformation that no one had anticipated. The young engineer who stepped off the plane in New York City was different from the shy boy who had left Willow Creek 8 years before. His eyes carried the confidence of someone who had succeeded in life through his own effort, but also a deep vulnerability upon discovering that he had a 6-year-old daughter living in precarious conditions. The first meeting between Andrew and Isabel took place at Mrs. Davis's house, a neutral environment where the girl felt safe. Violet insisted on being present, her arms crossed and jaw tense, revealing her determination to protect Isabel from any additional disappointment. Arthur was also there, in a strange position as an observer of a family meeting of which he was not a part, but from which he couldn't stay away. "She has your eyes," was the first thing Andrew said upon seeing Isabel, his voice thick with emotion. The resemblance was undeniable, the same expressive brown eyes, the same curious tilt of the head, even the way she bit her lower lip when she was thoughtful. Isabel observed him with the natural caution of children who have learned to be careful with unfamiliar adults. But there was something in her gaze that suggested instinctive recognition. During the conversations that followed in the days after, Andrew revealed an emotional maturity that surprised everyone. Instead of trying to immediately establish a paternal relationship, he focused on understanding the girl's story, the traumas they had faced, and especially the unbreakable bond between the sisters. His respectful approach gradually won Violet's trust, who had prepared for a battle for the right to continue caring for Isabel. "I didn't come here to separate you," Andrew explained in a private conversation with Violet at the church. "I came to understand how I can be part of Isabel's life without destroying what you've built together. You practically raised my daughter, Violet. That's not something that is forgotten or replaced." His words brought tears to the young woman's eyes, who for the first time since his arrival began to believe that maybe she wouldn't lose Isabel. It was during this period of adaptation that the most surprising news of all arrived. Zelda had successfully completed her treatment at the rehabilitation clinic and was asking to see her daughters. The information arrived through a call from the clinic itself, informing that the patient had demonstrated exceptional progress and was psychologically prepared to try to rebuild her family relationship. Violet's reaction was complex and painful to witness. For months, she had imagined this moment, alternating between hope and anger. Now that it had finally arrived, she felt paralyzed by conflicting emotions. "She abandoned us," she said to Arthur, her hands trembling as she held the letter from the clinic. "How can I simply forgive that? How can I trust that she won't abandon us again?" Isabel, on the other hand, reacted with the pure joy of small children. "Mommy is okay," she asked repeatedly, jumping around the church. "Is she coming home?" Her genuine happiness made it even more difficult for Violet to express her own reservations about the reunion. The family reunion took place at the hospital where Isabel had recovered from pneumonia, a neutral location that offered medical support if needed. Zelda arrived, accompanied by a social worker from the clinic, her movements revealing the nervousness of someone who knew they had much to explain and little time to do it. Physically, she was unrecognizable. Clean and tidy hair, healthy weight, clear eyes that showed no signs of substances, but they were the eyes of a woman who had been through hell and survived to tell the story. "Violet," was the first word she said, her voice breaking upon seeing her eldest daughter. "You've grown so much. You've become a woman." Her hands reached out hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to touch the daughter she had abandoned. Violet remained motionless for long seconds before taking a step forward, allowing a cautious embrace that carried years of hurt and repressed hope. Isabel had no hesitations. She ran into her mother's arms with the absolute confidence of small children, as if the months of separation had been just a few days. "I knew you were coming back," she said, burying her face in Zelda's neck. "Violet said you were sick, but I knew you were going to get better." Zelda's explanations were painful and honest. She told about the addiction that had consumed her life, about the terrible choices she had made prioritizing drugs instead of her daughters, about the destructive relationship that had led her to rock bottom. More importantly, she recognized without reservations the damage she had caused and assumed full responsibility for her actions. "I don't expect immediate forgiveness," she said, looking directly at Violet. "I know you had to be a mother and father to Isabel when I completely failed. I just hope for the chance to prove that I can be different now, that I can be the mother you deserve, even if it's too late to recover all the lost time." During the weeks that followed, a new family dynamic began to form. Zelda found work at Mrs. Davis's bakery, who offered the opportunity not only out of kindness, but because she recognized a woman genuinely committed to her recovery. Andrew, in turn, decided to stay in the United States temporarily, using his savings to open a small engineering consulting office in Willow Creek. Arthur observed all these transformations with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. The family was reuniting, finding ways to heal old wounds and build a future together. He had been a catalyst for some of these changes, but now he seemed to be becoming superfluous in the lives of the people he had learned to love. It was Violet who first noticed his gradual distancing. "You're avoiding us," she said one afternoon, finding him at the bakery at his usual table. "Why?" Her direct question forced him to confront feelings he had tried to ignore. "You're building a real family," he replied. "You don't need a stranger interfering anymore." His words revealed a sadness that Violet immediately recognized. It was the same feeling of not belonging anywhere that she had carried for months. "You're not a stranger," she said, sitting across from him. "You're family, in the strange way that families sometimes form. Isabel asks why you don't come see us anymore, and I miss you too." Her words brought an unexpected emotion that Arthur struggled to control. The final revelation came during the Christmas celebration at the town square of Willow Creek. The whole community had gathered to celebrate, and for the first time in months, everyone was present. Zelda volunteering at Mrs. Davis's stand, Andrew helping to set up the decorations, Violet coordinating activities for the children, and Isabel running freely among them all, finally sure that her family was complete. Bernice was also there, but in a very different position. The investigations into her real estate practices had resulted in lawsuits that forced her to return several properties acquired illegally. She remained in town, but with her influence drastically reduced, watching from afar the community celebration that represented everything she had tried to destroy. "You know what I've learned?" Arthur said to Violet as they watched Isabel play with other children in the square. "That family isn't about blood or money or properties. It's about choosing to love people every day, even when it's hard." His words reflected a deep transformation that had occurred over those tumultuous months. Violet smiled, adjusting the new scarf that Zelda had knitted for her. "I've learned something too," she said. "I've learned that sometimes people come into our lives when we need them most, even if it's not in the way we expected." She looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and genuine affection. The party continued late into the night, but the most significant moment happened when Isabel insisted that everyone pose for a photo together. "To remember the day our family became complete," she explained with the simple wisdom of children. In the photo that Mrs. Davis took, everyone was there: Zelda, Violet, Isabel, Andrew, and Arthur, united not by blood, but by the choice to love and care for each other. Months later, when Arthur offered a real partnership in his company to Violet, officially recognizing her exceptional administrative skills, she accepted not as charity, but as the recognition of her worth that she had always deserved. Isabel was attending school, speaking fluently about her father Andrew and about her uncle Arthur, while Zelda slowly rebuilt the trust of her daughters through consistent actions and unconditional love. True wealth, Arthur realized, was not in the custom furniture he sold or in the big house where he lived alone. It was in the mornings at Benny's bakery, in the afternoons helping Isabel with her homework, in the serious conversations with Violet about the future of the company, and in the family Sundays at the simple house where Zelda and the girls now lived. It was the discovery that sometimes the truest families are those built by love and choice, not just by blood, and that personal redemption comes not through individual success, but through the genuine human connections we manage to build along our journey through life.